This investigation understands that terrorism is a worldwide threat. It's a variety of networks. It obviously understands that Osama bin Laden is a key part of a number of terrorist organizations and operations, but we have not in any way limited our investigation or our understanding of these difficulties to the Al-Qaeda or the Osama bin Laden network or organization. We consider terrorism to be a challenge to our way of life generally, and while he has been named as a prime suspect, we are not limiting our investigation or excluding other options.
And before we get to the legislation, one other thing. We have heard from some in law enforcement that there's the possibility that these terrorists, I mean, you heard the Secretary raising the possibility that terrorists could use biological, chemical warfare. Do you have evidence that any of that has been planned, and what are we doing to protect against it?
Well, obviously our effort is to disrupt and to incarcerate, export, deport people who are involved in terrorist activities. Chemical and biological agents are very dangerous, and we have last week, for example, alerted those responsible for the infrastructure and the components of vital services in the United States to be especially aware and sensitive. We'll take every action to protect our resources. We need to have a heightened sense of awareness.
Mr. Secretary, Mr. General, you will be the legal authority for any kind of military action we take. You serve on the National Security Council. What is your opinion of this question of whether assassination is legal under these circumstances?
Well, the President of the United States has indicated that we are at war, and he's very concerned. I'm not going to talk about any particular policies. I just think it's important for us to know that the nation is being led by a president who understands the gravity of these issues and has indicated that he believes that there was an act of war perpetrated on the United States, and we're going to do those things that are necessary to protect the interests of the United States.
Would you like to see Congress remove the stricture against assassination?
I'm not going to comment on those protocols at this time.
What about, let's turn to congressional action. Would you like to see Congress allow for more surveillance?
We do need to have improved surveillance capacity. We need for the laws relating to terrorism to at least give us the same kind of surveillance and search capacity that we have against organized crime. And in some areas that's disparate now. It's different. It's easier to investigate someone involved in illegal gambling schemes than it is to investigate someone involved in terrorism. For phone taps, for example, our law now provides that we have to get a new order every time we go to a new telephone or to a different jurisdiction with a phone. We need for our phone tap legislation to follow an individual so that no matter where an individual goes, we have the capacity to develop the surveillance, the intelligence information from that kind of phone tap. And those are the kinds of things we're going to be talking with leadership on the Hill about immediately, about helping. Now, the Hill has been very helpful so far. It is to be commended for its response in terms of the resources to fight this scourge of terrorism at this turning point in our history. But we're going to ask them to assist in providing new tools to upgrade and strengthen those tools we have to fight terrorism.
As you know, General, there's been some hesitation in Congress up to this point about that because of concerns about privacy, concerns about American civil liberties. Are you saying that we should put those concerns aside for now? Well,
take a look at a couple of these things. There's no reason why a terrorist should have greater privacy rights than a person in organized crime. It's simply not a concern about privacy that we're talking about in that setting. It's just the fact that we haven't assigned the priority to terrorism previously in legislation that we need to assign now. We do need to take the steps necessary. Technology has outpaced the old wiretap laws. It used to be that a telephone was what someone used in his or her own home. Now telephones travel. There are disposable phones, for example, and it's time for us to have a wiretap law that reflects the fact that what we are really interested in is not what a phone is or whose particular phone it is, but in our ability to tap the communications of a specific suspect individual upon whom we've gotten a court order to surveil their communication.
Now, what about another question along those lines? Some terrorism experts say the best way to protect airlines, for instance, is through passenger profiling. You have been against racial profiling in law enforcement. What about passenger profiling for the airlines, which might have stopped some of these people?
Well, I'm against using race as a profiling component. We will have a tough airline security system, and we will ask everyone to respond to a more secure, more demanding regime that relates to passengers on airlines. I believe profiling people based on their race is unconstitutional. We will do everything within the Constitution to promote the security of our airlines, and I believe having tough security responsibilities and requirements for airlines generally is the answer in terms of airport security.
What about putting sky marshals onto airplanes, as the Israelis do?
Well, we have done that in the past, and that's certainly one of the options which I believe would be appropriate. And I would say that the Justice Department has already offered that some of our law enforcement officials, whether they be Border Patrol agents or U.S. Marshals, could be made available to the transportation system to elevate our security in this specific time of need.
And finally, Mr. General, do you expect any more arrests today? Do you expect any further developments in the investigation today?
Well, when you have 4,000 agents working and you have interviews being conducted, questioning of individuals who may have information at any time, developments can happen in terms of arrests, and arrests as they relate perhaps to the criminal and terrorist activity, or arrests for purposes of detaining individuals so that they can be maintained as witnesses. And so it'd be inappropriate for me to signal any in particular, but when we have this kind of effort, the most massive investigation in the history of the United States, I think we'll be expecting developments.
Thank you very much. Attorney General John Ashcroft joining us from near Camp David. Now for some analysis, we go to ABC's Pierre Thomas. Pierre, what you heard there and what you've been hearing about the investigation, tell us about it.
Well, one of the things that struck me about what Ashcroft said today is that there was sort of a tacit admission that the United States does not have a firm handle on the number of terrorist organizations operating within the United States. One official I talked to yesterday said, look, we're not thinking that anything is imminent, but we just don't know. To give you an example of what I'm talking about, 2 men were picked up the day of the attacks near Texas. They were riding an Amtrak train. My sources tell me they had box cutter knives. They also had $25,000 in cash. These 2 men have been flown to New York, according to my sources, and there's some indications right now, according to my source, that they have ties, potentially have ties to the hijackers. Now, again, it's another example that these groups were widespread, operating for quite some time, Koki, and they are trying to get a handle on that, and it's very worrisome to them.
Okay, thanks very much, ABC's Pierre Thomas. Joining us now is the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, Bob Graham. He joins us from Miami. Thanks for being with us, Senator Graham.
Thank you, Koki.
Senator Graham, you have been quoted as saying that that these incidents are not over, that this set of terrorist incidents are not over. Can you tell us what you mean by that?
I had a briefing as recently as this morning by the CIA, and they indicated the following. One, that the evidence that they had gathered thus far increasingly did focus attention on Sunni extremists and specifically the bin Laden group. Second, that there was also evidence that there might be other groups, including other terrorist groups outside of Afghanistan, that might be involved in this tragic situation. And that third, this was not necessarily a single act on Tuesday, but rather part of a larger plan. There might be further aspects of that plan yet to be played out, both within the United States and outside.
Given that, what should this country be doing? Should people be going on airplanes, going back to work, going to ball games?
We have got to begin to resume normal life, but normal life is not going to be the same as it was on Monday. There will be substantially greater security. I flew on a plane yesterday and will do so again today, and was impressed with the additional restrictions that were imposed. But we cannot allow the terrorists to win the ultimate victory of making them like them, making us be a society that gives up its freedom and liberties and begins to act in the cowardly way that terrorists do.
Of course, the fact that they were able to succeed has been attributed to a massive failure of intelligence. Do you see that as a massive failure of intelligence, and do you think that the CIA chief, George Tenet, should resign?
I do not believe that George Tenet should resign. I believe that he has served this nation well and honorably. What you don't know in this battle against terrorism are all the victories that have been won, because those are all won in the darkest shadows of confidentiality. This was clearly a failure. Who precisely, or what institution, or what failure of resources or others was responsible is something that we'll have to know later. The Senate Intelligence Committee is going to be introducing legislation next week which will deal with some of the issues that we think were probably involved, including the fact that we need to have someone in charge of the U.S. federal government's responsibility for terrorism. We have too much
of a terrorism czar?
We need to have if you want to use that term, we need to have someone who has the ability to establish a national program, allocate resources, and be held accountable for our response against terrorism.
Now, there are criticisms that there were Clinton-era regulations forbidding the employment of certain foreigners to penetrate terrorist organizations. Essentially, they didn't want to do business with bad guys. Do you think those should be lifted?
Yes. Essentially, what those regulations restricted was the ability of intelligence agencies, particularly the CIA, to employ people who had suspect backgrounds. The fact is, Koki, if you're going to get someone who has the capability of getting close to one of these terrorist cells, you're not likely to start looking in a monastery to find them. They're going to be people who have had some prior association and probably have had some prior involvement in the activities of those cells. So you think that those regulations should be lifted.
The other criticism is that the people who actually do have those kinds of human resources in those organizations are the Russians. But to get the Russians to cooperate with us, they have always asked for a quid pro quo on Chechnya. Is there any way of getting to those Russian assets?
Well, I was in Pakistan 2 weeks ago, and prior to that had some briefings with Russian officials as to their attitude towards Afghanistan. And frankly, they are very concerned about the Taliban. It not only is a destabilizing force on their southern border, but it also is a major source of drugs, particularly heroin, coming north into Russia.
So do you think they will now cooperate with us and let us?
I believe that Russia will assist us in our efforts to eliminate the terrorists in Afghanistan.
Finally, Senator, do you think that the stricture against assassination should be lifted?
Yes. In fact, it has largely been lifted. And let me say, this is not a legislated restriction. This is an executive order that goes back to President Ford and has been renewed by every president since that time. But if you're going to deal with a terrorist, there is no way to do it preemptorily other than to be able to use the strongest force to prevent them and eliminate their capability to attack American citizens. And if that means that we have to have the authority to assassinate people before they can assassinate us, yes, we should free that stricture, and the President of the United States can do it at his will.
Thank you so much, Senator Bob Graham, Chairman of the Intelligence Committee.
Thank you.
Sam?
Well, Koki, all during this program, we've been talking in one way or another about Osama bin Laden, the shadowy figure thought to be in Afghanistan, who is the prime suspect, obviously, behind the attacks this last Tuesday. Americans do not have to agree with what he did, but it might serve us well to see if we could understand, if we can, why he did what he did. And joining us to discuss that is John Miller in New York, ABC's Pierre Thomas at the FBI, and, of course, John McWethy, our man at the Pentagon. John Miller, What motivates Osama bin Laden? I mean, he's been described as someone who simply hates America, but is there